Somewhere in the frozen plains of Russia, there is a prison that the world's most dangerous men enter and never leave. Not because the walls are too high, not because the guards are too many, but because the system inside was designed with one singular purpose: to break the human will so completely that escape becomes a concept the mind can no longer even form. The men inside Black Dolphin have committed crimes so severe that Russian law ran out of adequate punishment. They were not sent here to be rehabilitated. They were sent here to disappear. And what happens inside these walls is a story that most governments would prefer you never heard. But someone always talks. And tonight, you are going to hear everything. Before we go inside those walls, if stories like this one matter to you, stories that pull back the curtain on the darkest corners of human systems, then subscribe now. Every week we go deeper. Every week the story gets harder to look away from. Now, let us go to Black Dolphin. Black Dolphin Prison sits in the city of Solovletsk, in the Orenburg Oblast of Russia, less than 30 miles from the Kazakhstan border. The air here in winter drops to -30 degrees Celsius. The landscape is flat, gray, and endless in every direction. There is nowhere to run even if a man somehow made it past the fences, the dogs, the motion sensors, and the arm towers. The prison was built in the 18th century and has been reformatted over the decades into something the Russian penal system calls a special rare colony. That phrase is bureaucratic language for a place that houses only those sentenced to life imprisonment. Russia abolished the death penalty in 1996. Black Dolphin became the alternative. It became the end of the line. But what does the end of the line actually look like when you are living inside it every single day? Every prisoner inside Black Dolphin begins and ends his day the same way. He wakes at 5 in the morning to a bell that has no warmth in its tone. He is required to be on his feet within 60 seconds. He must stand facing the wall of his cell for inspection. His hands must be clasped behind his back. His head must be bowed. He is not permitted to look a guard in the eye. From that moment until lights out at 10 at night, he is in a state of permanent supervised motion. Prisoners are not allowed to sleep during daylight hours. Guards check the cells every 15 minutes around the clock. The moment a prisoner sits on his bunk between 5 in the morning and 10 at night, he is punished. The chair in the cell exists. The bed does not during the day. For most men, this ritual begins to do something to the mind within weeks. For the men of Black Dolphin, it has been going on for years, some for decades. His name is Alexander Bychkov. He entered Black Dolphin having confessed to the murders of a number of homeless men across Russia. But it was not the murders alone that sent him here. It was what came after. Bychkov kept detailed journals. Not journals of remorse. Journals of method, of preparation, of what he described in clinical language as a personal project spanning several years. He was not a man who acted in rage or impulse. He was a man who acted with patience and ritual. Inside Black Dolphin, Bychkov was placed in a cell alone. The psychological profile submitted with his file noted that he had an extraordinary capacity to appear calm, reasonable, and even likable in controlled interactions. Guards were instructed to maintain professional distance. The instruction existed for reasons that were never fully explained in the official documentation. What the documentation did explain was that Bychkov requested books, philosophy mostly, and that he read them slowly, underlining passages with a precision that unsettled the officers who reviewed his cell. Mikhail Popkov spent years working as a police officer in Angarsk, Siberia. He drove a patrol car. He wore a uniform. He was trusted by the community he had sworn to protect. Between 1992 and 2010, he used that trust as a weapon. Popkov would offer rides to women walking alone at night. The women accepted because he was a police officer, because the car had markings, because who would refuse a ride from a man whose job was safety? Popkov was convicted of 78 murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded Russian history. When he arrived at Black Dolphin, something unusual happened. Other prisoners, men convicted of mass murder and organized atrocity, refused to share communal space with him. In the brutal hierarchy of Black Dolphin, even killers have a code. And Popkov had broken something in that code that even they would not forgive. The question of how a man hides that scale of violence behind a badge for nearly 2 decades is one that Black Dolphin offers no answer to. It only offers the consequence. Prison psychologists who have studied life sentence facilities describe a phenomenon that occurs in men confined without hope of release. The first stage is resistance. The prisoner fights the routine, fights the boredom, fights the psychological erosion. The second stage is negotiation. The mind begins to create internal worlds, memories replayed, futures imagined, as a survival mechanism. The third stage is what psychologists call settlement. The man stops fighting the institution and begins to become it. His personality reorganizes itself around the constraints of the cell. His sense of time collapses. He stops counting days. He starts counting meals. Inside Black Dolphin, most long-term prisoners are in stage 3. They have not broken in the dramatic sense. They have simply reconfigured. The human animal is adaptable beyond almost any external pressure. What Black Dolphin tests is whether that adaptability has a flaw. For one prisoner, the answer to that question took 11 years to arrive. Noah Lee Bychkov was convicted in connection with a series of bombings that killed dozens of civilians. He arrived at Black Dolphin in his early 40s, physically strong, ideologically rigid, and completely silent for the first 3 months of his incarceration. He did not speak to guards. He did not speak to psychologists. He ate his meals. He stood for inspections. He performed the required motions of the day with mechanical compliance. But he offered nothing of himself to the institution. Prison staff noted in his file that his silence was not passive. It was deliberate. It was a form of resistance that the routine could not quite reach because it required no outward expression to maintain. He was present in body. But something essential had been removed to somewhere the prison could not access. In year 2, he began to speak. Not to staff. Not to psychologists. He began to speak only during the 1 hour of daily outdoor exercise, and only to the sky. What he said to the sky, no one at Black Dolphin ever officially recorded. The smell inside Black Dolphin is institutional and permanent. Disinfectant lead over concrete, dust lead over the particular odor of bodies in small spaces over long periods of time. The corridors are lit by fluorescent lights that hum at a frequency just noticeable enough to register subconsciously after weeks of exposure. The floors are worn smooth by decades of the same shuffling walk, the bowed head walk, the hands behind back walk that every prisoner performs every time he moves through the facility. Sound travels strangely in the building. A conversation in one wing can be heard as a murmur 2 wings away, stripped of its words but not its tone. At night, when the facility quiets to its minimum, men have reported hearing other men's breathing through the walls. Not talking, just breathing. Just the sound of other humans surviving the same night in the same building. It is the kind of detail that sounds minor until you have been inside a cell for 4 years, and the breathing of a stranger through concrete becomes the most human thing in your world. Not every man inside Black Dolphin arrived having made peace with what he had done. Sergei Tkach, convicted of 36 murders spanning nearly 2 decades, arrived at the facility having spent his trial attempting to minimize, redirect, and reframe his crimes. But something happened in year 3 of his sentence that prison staff described as unusual. He requested access to a priest. Not a psychologist. Not a lawyer. A priest. The request was granted. The sessions were supervised. Over the following months, staff noted a measurable change in Tkach's behavior. Not a dramatic transformation. Nothing that looked like cinematic redemption. But a quieting. A man beginning the process of sitting with something he had previously refused to look at directly. Whether that process constituted genuine reckoning or sophisticated psychological management of his environment, the staff were divided. But the request for the priest kept coming. Every week, without exception, for years. And whether a man can find something worth calling conscience inside Black Dolphin, or whether the institution simply reshapes guilt into a more manageable form, is a question that has no clean answer. Working at Black Dolphin is not a neutral occupation. Guards rotate on strict schedules precisely because extended exposure to the facility's population produces documented psychological effects in staff. Officers have reported recurring nightmares after long postings. A sense of moral contamination described by one former guard as feeling like the air inside the building gets into you and does not fully leave when your shift ends. The protocol requiring prisoners to bow their heads and face walls during movement was designed in part to protect staff. If a prisoner cannot make eye contact with a guard, a certain category of psychological manipulation becomes structurally more difficult. The institution designed its rules to protect the prisoners from escaping. But some of those same rules were designed to protect the guards from something harder to name. Because some of the men inside those cells were not passive. Some of them were still working. Vladimir Mukhankin was convicted of multiple murders and arrived at Black Dolphin with a psychological profile that used the word charismatic 17 times across 12 pages. He was not a large man. He was not physically imposing. What he was, according to every assessment conducted before and after his incarceration, was extraordinarily skilled at reading people and adjusting his presentation in real time to produce a desired response. In the outside world, this had made him dangerous in ways that went beyond violence. Inside Black Dolphin, the same skill became something different. Staff reported that interactions with Mukhankin left them feeling slightly off balance in ways they could not articulate precisely. He followed every rule. He performed every required behavior. He was, on paper, a model prisoner. But 3 separate guards requested transfers away from his wing within 18 months. None of them gave a specific reason. Each of them used the same phrase in their transfer requests. He watches differently. And what a man like Mukhankin does with 17 years of watching differently inside a maximum security prison is the kind of question that keeps facility psychologists employed and awake at odd hours. We are halfway through the story, and the names you have heard so far are only the beginning. What comes next involves a sequence of events inside Black Dolphin that the facility itself has never fully confirmed. Before we get there, check the link in the description. Then come back. Because what happens in the second half of this story changes everything you think you understand about what maximum security actually means. Stay with us. Every prison in the world develops an internal social structure regardless of what the official rules dictate. Black Dolphin is no exception. Despite the extreme isolation protocols, despite the no eye contact rules, despite the 15-minute cell checks, prisoners communicate. They communicate through the walls, through coded behavior during exercise hours, through the precise way a food tray is returned, through systems so subtle that they existed for years before staff identified them as systems at all. The hierarchy inside Black Dolphin places terrorists and politically motivated killers in one social category. Predatory killers who targeted the vulnerable occupy the lowest position. Between those poles is a complex negotiation of status that shifts constantly based on sentence length, behavior record, and information. In a place with no currency, information is everything. And some men inside Black Dolphin had more of it than the guards did. Which brings us to the prisoner whose information became a problem that Black Dolphin had no protocol for. His name has never been officially released. He is identified in leaked facility documents only by a prisoner number and the notation former state adjacent. He arrived at Black Dolphin following convictions that involved organized violence at a scale that implicated individuals still operating outside the prison system. From his first week, the facility administration received external pressure regarding his housing conditions, his access to communication, and his psychological assessment schedule. The pressure came through official channels but originated from sources that the facility director, by his own later account, found difficult to categorize as routine oversight. The prisoner himself said very little. He ate. He stood for inspection. He walked with his hands behind his back. But his file was reviewed by more senior officials in his first year than most prisoners receive in a decade. Something about his presence inside the facility made people outside the facility nervous. And when a maximum security prison makes the people outside nervous, the people inside notice. They always notice. The solitary confinement unit at Black Dolphin is a place that even long-serving staff describe in lowered voices. It is not different from the main cells in its physical dimensions. It is different in its completeness. In solitary, the 15-minute checks become 10-minute checks. The already minimal human contact of the general population is reduced further. Meals are passed through a slot. Exercise is alone and silent. prisoners in long-term solitary at Black Dolphin have been documented making repetitive physical movements, pacing, counting wall stones, performing calisthenics for hours not for fitness, but for the sensation of their own body existing in space. The mind needs feedback. It needs confirmation that it is still present, still real, still located in a body that occupies a specific point in the physical world. Solitary removes those confirmations, one by one, until the mind begins generating its own. 2 prisoners at Black Dolphin have spent more than 10 consecutive years in solitary conditions. Both are still alive. Whether alive is the right word is something the documentation leaves carefully unaddressed. Vasily Komarov was convicted of mass murder in the mid-Soviet era and arrived at what would become Black Dolphin as one of its earliest long-term residents. By the time the facility had formalized its special regime status, Komarov had been inside for years. He was, by then, an old man, physically diminished, largely silent, and possessed of a habit that confused every staff member who encountered it. He wrote poetry. Not on paper initially, because paper access was restricted. He wrote it on the wall of his cell with the edge of his thumbnail, pressing just hard enough to leave a mark in the paint that was visible only in certain light. When staff discovered the practice and reviewed what he had written, the facility psychologist submitted a report that described the content as unexpectedly technically accomplished and deeply strange. The poetry was never officially transcribed. The wall was repainted. But one guard copied 3 lines before the paint dried. He never explained why. He kept them in his wallet for 11 years. Black Dolphin's administration has, over the decades, refined its control protocols in response to specific incidents that the facility does not publicize. The no eye contact rule was formalized after an incident in the early years of the facility's operation that involved a prisoner and a guard, and an outcome the documentation describes only as requiring extended staff support. The movement protocols, the bowed head, the hands behind the back, the guard escort on every transition, was systematized over time as responses to specific failures of less formal approaches. The facility did not arrive at its current form through ideology alone. It arrived there through trial and error in a place where the cost of error was measured in human terms. Every rule at Black Dolphin has a story behind it. Most of those stories have never been made public. And then there was the incident that almost made everything public all at once. In the mid-2000s, according to multiple independent sources who have spoken to journalists covering the Russian penal system, something happened inside Black Dolphin that resulted in an unscheduled lockdown lasting several days. Official communications from the facility during that period are absent from the public record. Staff transfers occurred in the weeks following. A number of prisoners were moved to different wings without the standard documentation that typically accompanies such transfers. The facility director at the time gave one interview to a regional publication shortly afterward in which he described conditions at Black Dolphin as stable and under continuous professional management. He used the word stable 4 times in a 3-paragraph response to questions about the period in question. No journalist was granted facility access for 8 months following the incident. What triggered the lockdown, what occurred during it, and what its resolution required has never been officially confirmed. What has been confirmed is that 2 prisoners who were in the facility before the lockdown were not in the facility after it, and their transfer destinations were never made part of the accessible record. Among the population of Black Dolphin, the prisoners who draw the most sustained attention from facility psychologists are not always the ones with the most violent histories. Sometimes the ones who draw attention are the ones who appear, across years of observation, to feel nothing at all. One prisoner, serving a life sentence for a series of killings that were distinguished by their complete absence of apparent motive, had been assessed by 4 separate psychologists over 9 years. Each assessment reached a similar conclusion using different language. The 5th assessment, conducted when the prisoner had been inside for over a decade, used a phrase that had not appeared in the previous 4. The psychologist wrote that the prisoner did not appear to experience the facility as a punishment. He appeared to experience it as a preference. He was, by every behavioral measure, more comfortable inside Black Dolphin than any account of his pre-incarceration life suggested he had ever been outside it. And what that means for everything the prison system believes it is doing is a question with no comfortable resolution. Life inside Black Dolphin does not have a dramatic arc. That is perhaps the most disturbing truth the facility offers. There is no climax in the cinematic sense. There is no moment of confrontation that resolves into something cleaner. There is only the morning bell, the wall-facing inspection, the hands behind the back, the fluorescent the 15-minute check, the meal slot, the exercise hour in a concrete yard the size of a large room, the night, and then the morning bell again. For men serving 40, 50, 60 years, this is not a chapter. This is the whole book. Every day is the same sentence. Every morning is the same word. The word is still here. The word is still watched. The word is still contained. And yet men survive it. Which raises the question that sits at the center of everything Black Dolphin represents. Survival inside Black Dolphin requires a transaction that no prisoner discusses openly but every prisoner makes. Something must be given up. For some it is hope in its conventional form, the belief that circumstances will change, that release is possible, that the future holds a different shape than the present. For some it is identity, the sense of a continuous self that exists beyond the function of prisoner. For some, the psychologists believe, it is something closer to the feeling of time itself. Long-term prisoners in extreme confinement describe a state in which past, present, and future collapse into a single undifferentiated experience of now. Not a peaceful now. Not a meditative now. A now that is total and inescapable and that contains everything that was and everything that will never be, simultaneously, without relief. One prisoner described it to a psychologist as being buried alive in the present tense. The psychologist included the phrase in her report, without comment. Black Dolphin Prison exists at the extreme end of a question that every society with a justice system must eventually answer. What is punishment for? Is it deterrence? Is it public safety? Is it retribution? Is it the hope, however distant, of rehabilitation? Russia's answer, embodied in the concrete and fluorescent light and 15-minute checks of Black Dolphin, is unambiguous. For the men inside its walls, punishment is permanent. It is total. It is the complete removal of a life from the world of the living, while the biological fact of that life continues. The men of Black Dolphin did not receive death sentences. They received something that some philosophers and some former prisoners and some gods who worked there for too long have described as something harder to name than death. And whether that is justice, or whether it is something else entirely, depends entirely on who you ask and what they have seen. The men whose stories have moved through this script are not abstractions. They were born. They had childhoods. They made choices, catastrophic, irreversible choices, that ended other lives and redirected their own into the concrete corridors of Black Dolphin. The facility holds approximately 700 prisoners at any given time. 700 men, each with a file, each with a history, each standing at 5 in the morning with their hands behind their backs, facing a wall, waiting for a guard to confirm that they are still present. Some of them will die inside those walls. Most of them will. The facility has a small cemetery on its grounds. The graves are unmarked. The system that imprisoned these men also buries them, quietly, without ceremony, in ground that belongs to the state that decided they had forfeited the right to anything else. Whether we call that justice or something else depends on a conversation this society has not yet finished having. Black Dolphin does not ask for your sympathy for the men inside it. Neither does this story. What it asks, and what every serious examination of a place like this must eventually ask, is what we believe punishment is supposed to accomplish, and whether a facility like Black Dolphin accomplishes it, or whether it simply removes the question from sight, so we do not have to sit with the discomfort of answering it ourselves. Leave your answer in the comments, because this conversation does not end when the video does.